Well, thank you very much for incredibly fascinating afternoon and for concluding an incredibly rich day. I just want to start off the discussion here. And one of my loose thoughts throughout the day kept increasing that how far we have come, it's an obvious thing, but how far we've come from looking at building as stable and completed objects. And in a way, I think it was just the accumulation of arguments which made this extremely clear that working with as found conditions in the city or as buildings that, yes, there's historical values, but the way we approach things, it's no longer the question about, we fulfill the history of the past of the building. It's more like we look at the potentials for the future of the building. But again, that's quite removed from the way we were taught at some point in the past. So we don't think anymore about functional space. We have to think about construction, but then we suddenly have voids instead we have to deal with, which in a way is quite freeing. And I think it was really amazing to see the range of scales where the innovation lay. I think this morning, we talked about lobbies, we talked about rooms. Julian showed us a lot of drawings which didn't show any buildings at all. It was all about the different thresholds. Some of them were inside and outside sort of thing. So I think I wasn't quite clear about that until today, about how much we have moved in the field in that sense. And I think it's a roundabout way of coming back to something we discussed over lunch, which came from Stephen this morning about, can you teach adaptive reuse in, I can't remember how many weeks, in 17 weeks, And I think, well, clearly this afternoon, particularly also in the last presentation, you can't get around without thinking about construction, what you can find, and materiality. But beyond that, I think we don't teach our students about the historical value, about what to do with it. But I think it's such a complex range of things that, I think I want to put the question back to you. Can you teach adaptive reuse? Although it is probably not even, the term itself is so limited right now in terms of the range of scales and innovations we've seen. But I think I just want to open it out there. Can you teach adaptive reuse in 17 weeks? I'm just looking at you.
Yeah, should I take that? Possibly not, but I think you can, as teachers, I think you can convey an attitude, because that's what you do with your students, isn't it? You show your enthusiasm, you hear about their enthusiasms, you go for a walk, you look at places, and I suppose from my perspective on this anyway, I've always been fascinated and interested in trying to find out what it is the students are looking at and what they're seeing and what they're wanting to do. And there's a sort of greedy pleasure in not judging about what's around you. I think it's really exciting to decide that you can just take what you want and work with it. And that's something that I do try to convey. You can't make people do anything, really. But I think you can deliberate on an attitude that's generous, open, but also not just generous and open and, world-changing, because it's too vague, so you have to be incredibly precise. So I do think that jumping across scales is one thing that can be taught. Drawing people's attention to a nosing on a stair and at the same time looking at a skyline is quite easy to do. And to my mind, that starts to bring you towards what adaptive use. It's not even adaptive reuse, because that's a tautology. If you're adapting, then you're using. And so we're adapting. We're the ones adapting. It's not necessarily the materials being adapted always. It's like rediscovering, and that's what we need to do. And as Irene said this morning, you need ideas to do that. It's not going to happen by itself. You need to have an idea and a take, and you have to take a position.
So, just something about the terminology. I liked what you said earlier today, where you said it should just be use. And I've always seen the term adaptive reuse as redundant, because if you're reusing a building, obviously you're adapting it. Or it's kind of like saying reuse, reuse. But I like the idea that actually, I think it's because all these things fundamentally come down to attitude, don't they? So I think like the term reuse, in fact, it sort of implies that somehow buildings shouldn't be used continually. There's an implication that buildings shouldn't be reused. Otherwise, you would just call it use. Like the term really should be use, I think. That's why the only satisfactory term I've come to is working in existing buildings, which is a bit of a mouthful. But because I think behind all the other terms, somehow they feel kind of incorrect. But I think maybe you kind of hit the nail on the head, because it should be use. Anyways, that was one thing. The other thing I just wanted to say when you were speaking was this idea about like the students kind of finding their way. Maybe it's kind of like academic desire lines. Yeah. Anyways, sorry, I digress as usual.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you, the four of you, for these incredible presentations. And in many respects, my enthusiasm for hosting this conference goes back to listening to Anna Lee talk for twice as long during the summer, and it still wasn't enough, even at twice as long, to cover all the things that you wanted to describe. So there's so much to learn from that project. And so then it raises the question, how do we learn from these projects and turn it into a new kind of pedagogy? And I feel like we've heard a lot about that today. But I'm struck also by some tensions that are within this. And so just in a way, comparing two different kinds of attitudes. First of all, I love yesterday's mashed potatoes. So I'm absolutely with you, Rod, on that. I'm persuaded already. And I love yesterday's mashed potatoes partly because I recently was introduced to the idea that they could have olive oil instead of cream. And, so there was something about changing an aspect of the type that allowed me to fall in love. And there was this sort of adaptation I found in Claudia Roden's cookbooks. But let's say, on the one hand, a big part of what we've heard today is an attitude of appreciation that is for the particular, for the specific, paying attention to the detail, loving each thing as found. And then on the other hand, when we listen to Anna Lee, there's a sort of, one has to see that there's a pervasive modernist idea. And it touches as well on some of what Simon, you, and Stephen were talking about in the morning, finding something really quite special in the type, or as Irene earlier said today, the idea, the perpetuation of certain aspects of an idea, their modification, their adjustment. And I think some of what we have to clarify in the field is how we teach both things with a sort of correct balance. And I think, Rod, your presentation was inspiring, partly because you drew our attention to those sort of unique sensibilities that we might have as an architectural field. But I almost wonder the extent to which you're masking the knowledge that you actually have of the ideas, the types, and the buildings in telling us that. I'm wondering if you would come back to that.
Yeah, I'm really terrible at this thing. Okay, that's really good.
I think it has to do with what you
Okay. Great. Yeah, I was just saying I'm actually terrible at this bit. I suppose the bit of that talk that I found hardest to write was history as a quarry, and I think it's the hardest part because it's the bit I have fewest examples of, and it's so intrinsic to our kind of practice, I think. And I guess nowadays that kind of practice gets labelled working with references or something banal, but I suppose one of the delights of working where I work is that we have such a cosmopolitan staff, and that's partly why I dwelt on the names of people, and something that's a little bit under threat at the moment. And that cosmopolitanness is so spectacularly interesting because people bring ranges of discourse about ways of living, discourse about kinds of architecture, to dialogue about proposals, which are incredibly eye-opening and refreshing for me. I mean, I grew up in rural Oxfordshire, so it doesn't take much to open my eyes, but it was really a spectacular kind of environment to work in. And I suppose our relationship with practice, with teaching, has often been to do with questions of history and the status of history. And I suppose I was trying to work out why it was difficult to write that part. And it's because I didn't want to include a sort of rogues gallery of heroic modernism. It sort of feels like it's a compost out of which something grows, rather than a landmark you have to head for somehow. It's a terrible analogy. At some point, there's a critical mass of so much range of discussion of type, including modernist. I mean, the last image was pure Lina Bobardi, but they're orientated. Actually, they are kind of orientating things, and that's what I meant, I suppose, about if you make arancini with your leftover rice, don't stress about it. Mm-hmm. You know, that actually, like, if it becomes a recognizable thing, that's okay. And I think for such a long time in the 20th century, that wasn't okay, either because of a kind of misplaced connoisseurship or because of a sense of misplaced desire for novelty, really.
Annalie, perhaps if you pass the mic so that it gets recorded, just pass me this mic. Annalie, I was just kind of wondering, perhaps on the other side, do you think that the kinds of innovations that you made in relation to, say, Streets in the Sky, these are replicable, we might imagine? But then the investigations that you did to come up with 37 flat types, that conceivably is less so. I mean, how did you evaluate that as a kind of problem of the evolution of the type?
We really didn't want 37 flat types. We kind of went in with the pitch that we were going to try and save as much and reuse stuff and as much as possible, and without really interrogating how mad the plans were. We made an assumption because we only got given 2 weeks to do it. And I think the more that we thought about it and looked into the carbon saving of, we could reuse the walls. I mean, they were perfectly fine with a bit of sandblock board on, so we should do in it, and therefore we did all the work to do it, rather than just clear it all out and then probably phase one's a really good example of what you would do if you did that. But we set off in a different tack, and we kind of ended up having to do it. And actually, I mean, obviously it was more work for us, but I think it's given a really interesting mix of flats. They're much more varied, and there's a real identity to each of the flats that was there originally. And it's meant that the street facade is really varied because the windows, whereas on phase one, because the flats were all the same, it's much more homogenized. So it's kept more of the organic character of the building, because it always was a really organic building, even though, and that's what I felt as a student, it was weirdly like a piece of, like a cliff face or something. So it's kept that character. So I'm really pleased we did it. It was just a pain at the time.
Yeah. Just following on from that, one sort of, say, yet the other day, we were playing with ChatGPT inside of Housing and Urbanism, see what would happen if we asked it to identify Irénée Scalbert's interest in difference. And of course, it came up with a really nice series of paragraphs about what Irénée believes, and he was quite surprised that it seemed to mimic him rather well. What was then also interesting about that was that if one bases a kind of thinking on difference, that the search for a spectrum, or the search for difference, how do you align that with an idea of the general, the pursuit of the general, the repeatable, in a way, something that we can pursue with knowledge? And what struck me in your project is that somehow the more we understand the type, the more a kind of awareness of the potential of difference seems to come out. And that was kind of an exciting result from my point of view when you first presented that in the summer. Now I really want to model all 37 and see how they work.
I mean, I suppose looking back on it, because we made assumptions about the building based on how we would do things now, it's all about efficiency, it's all about the BIM model, and actually, it was a real surprise to see how random it was. I mean, it really, and actually, if you look further back, the story behind it is that they took all the streets, which are named after the original streets on the ground, and they kept neighbours together and moved them up. And perhaps that's why. Perhaps those are the original inhabitants' flat types put together to make a building. Which way around did they do it? I don't know. It's a strange building because there's so much written about it, and we've been foraging amongst kind of texts from the Architecture Review and also on site foraging for clues about it. We're still really none the wiser about why they did it like that.
I might have to make a romantic comment about that. When I'm thinking about difference, I was looking a couple of months ago at an East German housing estate, Plattenbau, proper German Plattenbau, where it's a shelf, variations. Some have 2 rooms, some have 3 rooms. And the architects attempted to put all the difference in the public realm and the services. They didn't manage quite, but the conception really was that you eradicate difference on the personal and private level, and instead you place it in the public realm. And I think today there was also quite a lot of emphasis on difference in the thresholds and in the intersections sort of thing. So this is not a critique against your 37 flat types at all. I think it's more a theoretical question where we, in thinking about as a society in difference, where we place the emphasis. I think it's just it's a speculation where I think it's rich to see also one could think about the public realm and difference, and sort of maybe at some point we're going to live differently, that we're not so emphasized that we need to live difference in our private realm. It's not a criticism, it's just reflection.
One other theme that I felt was very powerful today, and Julian, you raised it quite clearly, was the drawing of the threshold and the search for the layer and the overlap. And it was something that Stephen Bates spoke about this morning, and then before that, both Simon Henley and Stephen Taylor spoke about. And in fact, Simon, you opened up the day looking at the Anasazi's cliff dwellings, where we couldn't help but notice the manipulation of the envelope, as it were, such that the world, the outside world, is absorbed within the domain and creating a kind of crossover environment between the open world and the built, the closed. And then Stephen, you spoke earlier about the significance of the series of spaces that would define a new landscape. That kind of comes back, Julian, to yours. What I feel we didn't quite capture that first time around was the importance of seeing these two things together as something that actually brings both the study of the type and the urban area, the surroundings, into one frame. And that, I think, is one of the key ideas within, say, adaptation and how we use spaces and understanding their rhythms. And so I feel that one of the key outcomes from today has actually been that we need to improve our way of describing the interrelationship between type and the urban scale on precisely those grounds of understanding the interrelationship between the quite well-defined landscapes and the role of the envelope to create a mode of attention and address between users back and forth in those spaces. So I appreciated those comments. I wonder if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, thanks. It's making me think that in this country, housing is becoming unclear as a project. People want to develop it quickly. They think that they can build in a repetitive manner. And people often think that if we get it right, then everything can be repeated, efficient, and therefore the type becomes kind of super generic. And I think there's a super generic attitude to housing that it's not reflected in practice, because every housing developer finds out that they've got to actually fit the housing into a place, and the place has got specific constraints. And I suppose I've always thought of that as a kind of opportunity. So if you think of the housing as a generic condition, and the public space that exists that we want to use, reuse, use, that was already there, unless we're building in a desert. Even the desert exists, so but wherever we are, it's complicated, the housing goes there. Then rather than put the housing down, bang, and then see what's left, curate the specifics of the public realm as a landscape that sets up an infrastructure that makes the housing, even if it's a generic project, come alive. And so in housing, you have repeated units, you have repeated systems of building, but the lobby is a one-off funny thing. And a window with a surgery on the corner is a one-off thing. And you can start to pick little bits off of it. Even in the most cynical developer's project, you can start to pick the specific, bespoke, unlockable elements out of this generic structure and start to make it specific. And if you do that as a strategy early on, then you start to find out where you can pull and push the architecture as an integrated part of the place. So I think that we could be clearer about housing as a city condition that, even with a limited budget, needs to be understood as something that needs to go hand in hand with the place. I mean, it's a very simple thing to say, but I don't think it's usually designed strongly enough in that integrated way. And I think we could be better at understanding where we can make efficiencies and where we do want to put a bit of extra money into something. You know, we should not. I was once working for a developer who said you can do 15% architecture, the rest is a building. I had no idea what he meant, but I kind of, you know, it did make me think that you can start to talk about an unevenness of the housing, in this case, let's say the housing, the ways up to it, the lobby. I mean, you know, there's some architects in this room who do this brilliantly, but we can be more cognizant about it, more explicit, and try to communicate that case to the people we work with who are building these projects.
I wonder if there are questions from the audience. We have not only our afternoon speakers here, but we also still have Simon Henley, Stephen Taylor, and Stephen Bates in the room. And there won't be that many options in your lives when you have such a wonderful collection of architects to ask questions to.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting day, all of you. Can I pick up first word was quality, which I think came from you, so quality. And then I was wanting to ask a question about the de Beauvoir housing scheme, which I fully appreciated the connective tissue of the shared spaces at the ground level. But when it came to the roofscape, I did wonder whether or not the roofs were a point at which you came through a threshold, which you left the communal area, went to your own area, but had communion with, as it were, the sky at the top. Also, it's a potentially absorbent surface to absorb the increased rain that we're going to be having. So there are sort of opportunities of diverting water, which I think is going to become a huge climatic issue architecturally because of the flash floods that we get. And that is on the existing housing stock as well, because the flash floods go over the flashings of valley gutters. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. But lastly, I think Irene mentioned Le Corbusier and the Unité. And the reason I think that possibly the people are so happy there is that they've got access to the roof, which is a fantastic scape in its own self. I don't know how many saw the sunset last night, but it was spectacular. And if you had been on any roof, you could have fully enjoyed it. I was in my own house and I tried to go and photograph it from the street, but actually it was no good. When I went to the top, I photographed it, but it would have been even better if I'd been on a proper roof. So I think the fifth elevation is, something used worldwide now as a productive area. Thank you.
Do you want to? I think Steve. Thank you for that question. In fact, I failed miserably to speak about the roofs. So this project is very long, ongoing, 5-6 years in the making, still not through planning. The roofs are absolutely part of the landscape. And it was very interesting during COVID when a lot of the consultation on this project took place, and people living in the existing towns with no outside space, largely, came to the fore as a big issue. So at the beginning part of COVID, consultation was taking place on the street of the estate. And there was a lot of discussion about the idea that the roofs were part of this tapestry of productive gardens. The stairs and the lifts go to the roof, and that is very much where the project sits. But as I think all of us here confront all the time, to make housing like this happen in a climate where the cost of construction has gone up by, in some cases, 40%. Simon and I, our offices right now, this week, last week, next month, are in the midst of the most difficult process of value engineering to try to bring the cost down. And one of the things that we are fighting tooth and nail is to maintain the roofs as collective spaces. But there's enormous pressure to drop it. And there's an enormous pressure to not have the lifts and stairs overrun. Providing this doesn't go on YouTube, I can say, silent tactics is to fight to keep the lift and the stair up to the roof level, but embrace the lack of access today, in the hope that in the years ahead when this project gets built, and it could be another 2 or 3 or 4 years, regimes change many times in that. Our client personnel has changed 4 times during the process. We would hope that we can claw back some of those fundamental ideas. But I 100% agree with you. The roofs are for the residents. I don't know, Simon, if you wanted to add to that. I agree.
Simon and Stephen, I would like to stay on the estate for a bit longer and ask you another question of it. I'll confess, I spent a few weeks recently looking at your plans. I was asked by one of our clients to sort of, I hate the expression peer review, but kind of express my thoughts on it. And I was really feeling bad that I couldn't kind of interview you on that. So I feel that this opportunity is a great opportunity to actually ask questions that I was asking myself. Stephen, you said that it should never be demolished. You made it very clear that you think that it should never, never, ever be demolished. Now, I'll start with the question, do you really believe that it should never be demolished? Because I'm sure you would agree with me that cities are about transformation, and we are all designing buildings hoping that every next project will make our city a better place for all, and every next project is a stepping stone towards a better collective future, if you like. I'm sure there are better ways to describe that kind of positive transformation and impact that exceptional projects have on a wider context. Now, what I felt is that although as architects we do appreciate the quality, some of the qualities, architectural qualities of the buildings, it doesn't do justice to the area. And there is such an amazing potential to this site in this location. And if we were to actually think about how to improve, brief that you were given, guys, had to be changed. And my question to you is, A, if you could change the brief, how would you change the brief that you were given and you were so lucky, to secure this commission? And then second question, when you're saying there are those amazing qualities, but if you think about them not as an architect but as a resident of those buildings, do you really believe that the residents appreciate those qualities that you guys appreciate? If we are trying to sort of imagine life in a two-bed flat as a family of 6 people and being told, guys, it's so great that you don't deserve any better than that. So let's not never demolish.
Should I start? Sure. Go on. Well, no, I think we absolutely believe that there's no reason to demolish. In fact, the really interesting thing about that estate is, whilst the kind of the literal plane of the ground has been so confused by the entropy of maintenance and the politics, money, those kind of things, an absence of confidence in what to do with the ground. The idea that it's not a landscape, it's a liability, and it is a landscape. And there's lots of estate regeneration schemes where it's not necessarily quite tabula rasa, but it's pretty close. And that's very confident, if not arrogant, to think we can just do better. And the really interesting thing about its urbanism, and clearly we're in the process of adjusting its kind of urban grain, but there's a liberty and a freedom and an openness to that urban grain which we're very mindful of not overwriting and losing. And it can certainly take, there are places where you might build more buildings, but there's no reason to demolish buildings to somehow find a more optimal solution. I mean, the really interesting thing about the 6-stroke, the sort of 6-story datum, which all those buildings, or the majority of those buildings, subscribe to, is that I think we've talked about it, but when we're not collaborating, we've been talking about it in our office, is when there's pressure to build taller. If you think of a theatre, the auditorium of a theatre, it's round about 6 stories. Well, it might be 4, maybe 5. But in other words, it has something to do with our senses. It's roughly how far we can see. It's roughly how far we can hear. And therefore, when you start to think about families and children playing and parents in flats and looking down and people just having a sense that ground plane is, that garden has something to do with my home, wherever my home is, that 6 stories, whether it's by accident that they decided, or whether that was very sort of scientific in their observation 50 years ago, it's absolutely right. So the first part of the question, no reason to demolish.
I would just add to that a couple of things. I mean, never say never. There's sometimes maybe there's very strong reason, but when I look at that, you look at London. It's been built and rebuilt many times, and I think all of us hold regrets about parts of the city that became unfashionable at different points in history. And indeed, this estate, the land of this estate, was demolished not because of World War II, but because of a different fashion that was in place at the time. And some of us may not like those buildings, or may hold some feeling against our perception of the home, the quality of the home. And I think Annalise spoke very well about a kind of architecture that can be improved with some careful reworking, and that can take place on these existing buildings. Not part of our project today, but I think the reason I say never is because I'm quite sure that in 100 years' time, future generations will look back on that estate with a sense of nostalgia and delight and charm. Those buildings will have been transformed by someone like Annalise. They'll have been improved. They'll have been thermally made better. And hopefully our project will improve all of the nasty, terrible ground plane. And I think there's another aspect to it, that the range of new homes will bring in a whole new generation of people. And workspace, which we didn't really speak about, but other uses that will take away the monofunctional nature of those estates that are part of the problem of their time. So, never say never, but I think we have to challenge the temptation to take away something that the phrase of your practices, Rod's practices talk at the Royal Academy the other week. What was it? All buildings are beautiful. Something like that. Yeah, it's a question of perception and time.
Thanks, Steve. There's a question over here.
Thank you for all the participants and presenters and contributors and the organizers for what kind of amalgamates into an incredibly complementary set of descriptions, offerings, drawings, and I wanted to return to, I think what I heard, the challenge of teaching adaptive reuse. And I think if I heard somebody say, how do you teach adaptive reuse in 17 weeks? I hope they meant 16 months or something, but maybe there's a module, so maybe hear more about that. But just the challenge of teaching adaptive reuse. And so we've heard today about everything from thermal breaks to ceiling heights to materials. And then on the more subjective side, we've talked about appreciating the qualities of materials, the quality of light. And I think it was Simon that used the B word, beauty. How on earth do we teach people to appreciate beauty and to describe beauty? But maybe one of the points is how language, in a way, how limited our tools for describing the more subjective aspects of the results of adaptive reuse is a really big challenge, finding a shared language for subjective qualities of the built environment. So it's slightly an open question. I think I'm slightly putting it towards Rod and Annalie, because I like their analogy so much of the culinary analogy to how you might teach, but also the fabulous squint test. I mean, how do you teach adaptive reuse?
The last year that I taught undergraduates, we worked in Bacton Gasworks. It's one of the largest infrastructural nodes in the country. It's protected by armed police. It was difficult to get access. And I suppose the students, I don't know that I taught them very much. I hoped that they lit a fire for themselves about the nature of that place, the way the community of Bacton was dispossessed by fossil fuel companies, and made suggestions for direct action that reclaimed that piece of land. Charlotte Bird's project stands out, where she re-established a right-of-way. She invented pieces of infrastructure that went over oil and gas pipelines. She suggested methods of decontamination of the site, all of which left a kind of would leave a long-term physical legacy as the fossil fuel infrastructure recedes from that site. And I suppose I thought that was a very beautiful kind of speculative leading to a future world in which those infrastructures are decontaminated or entombed or removed, and in which a kind of new public, organic, regenerative landscape is left behind. But she didn't imagine it as a kind of finite architecture. She understood it and drew it as a kind of long-term social process, and an embedded social process. I thought that was great.
Oh, yeah. I think the question about how do you teach it made me just try and think about what our process was, which, I mean, because I've got a product, I can talk about that, but I was just delving back into how did we end up there? And, obviously we did something very different from the 5 other architects who we were shortlisted with, because I went and looked at their flats. And I do think it was weirdly like foraging, walking around, spotting bits of lino, looking in the RIBA library, we're just listening to music, because it's in a few bits of music. And it was almost like, and then, you put it all together, and you have to work out what you keep and what you throw away. And particularly building like that, where there's so much kind of baggage associated with it. What baggage do you take on? What do you discard? And I know there's lots. This just generates so many conversations about social housing, Thatcherism. You could go off on it, and you have to just choose what you think adds, and then discard what you think doesn't add. That's.
But I guess it comes also back to the question then of teaching values, or how to try to see and identify values. And I think repeatedly today we also heard about the way you begin to engage with the place, partly through speaking to people, partly through understanding their appreciation of the place, partly through drawing, maybe modeling, etc. So I think that's also, again, coming to that. I did want to pass it on to Stephen right now anyway, also to sort of think a bit about education, how that relates.
It was I who referred to 17 weeks, because in Munich, like other European schools, a semester is the design project. So you do 2 design projects a year, and it's not impossible to teach reuse, but I'm suspicious because of the tendency to be rather superficial, because the discussion we had this morning, about recording, about fully understanding places, is very difficult to do in 17 weeks. There's another factor that I think can be placed in front of the institution, the educational institution itself, because certainly in Munich there is a point system, and in terms of what you're meant to be taught and what you deliver in your portfolio, an expectation of a design, etc., etc. And that also creates difficulties when it comes to such projects. And I know that that is the case at ETH as well, because a friend and colleague, Anne Fontaine, is having the same problems, that students are complaining that there's no design in the semester. So I think the schools have to catch up within this conversation, to work out the value. What should they be looking at? Because there's a lot of architects and teachers who will talk about reuse, but there are limits that aren't spoken about. As this is an interface between practice and education, it's not just about the process of the teachers, it's the structure of the school itself.
We're almost at the limit of our time, but I'd like to perhaps finish on that point. We here at the AA have a number of diploma units that are becoming increasingly interested in material flows, to take Diploma 18, but also really thinking much more about the question of the material involved in construction. And, one of the things that I was struck by your comment this morning, Steve, was that perhaps part of the reason why we feel so doubtful or skeptical, as you put it, maybe doubtful is too strong, but skeptical, is that we recognize that there's a very palpable encounter with the real when we teach adaptation, modification of the existing. And I think sometimes that makes us uncomfortable. And that's, I think that's no different if we're designing afresh. It's just that we hide that aspect of it. And so I think one of the things that this emphasis upon adaptation, modification, reuse, I'll go ahead and say reuse, just in the sense that, it's part of an idea about retaining, and as opposed to getting rid of. But I think that the whole emphasis that we're seeing in all of these projects is perhaps transforming even how we see new design. And it's encouraging, I think, a crossover that is rather exciting for the moment. And so one of the things that I would like to do now is to thank all of you so much for your contributions today. It's given us a huge amount of thought for the coming year, every single one of you. And I most especially would like to thank Tim Collett for taking the lion's share of the organizational duties and then presenting us with a delightful discussion of what you're doing at Nottingham. I think we can all learn from that. And so it's been, for us, a real opportunity to bring our schools together and to use these contacts to drive a conversation forward. So I'd like to thank all of you very, very much and invite you upstairs for a drink, for everyone.